She stood alone against the badge. What happened next shocked the whole town. It started with something so ordinary. A soft breeze, a quiet street, and a paper bag filled with cinnamon rolls. Rachel Whitmore wasn't doing anything unusual that afternoon, just walking home from the corner bakery, thinking about whether she'd make tea before dinner. But within minutes, her life would be turned upside down in front of dozens of strangers. A police officer stopped her. No explanation. No warning. And before she could speak, before she could even understand what was happening, her dignity was torn away. Right there, on the sidewalk. Imagine being humiliated like that. Not behind closed doors, but out in the open, where every passerby could see, and no one stepped in to help. Rachel froze in that moment, surrounded by silence, swallowed by shame. But what the officer didn't know, what no one expected, was that Rachel wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. What began as a personal nightmare soon unraveled into something much bigger. As Rachel began to speak, others came forward. One voice became two, then five. And behind their stories lay a chilling truth about a man in uniform who had hurt far too many for far too long. But this time, justice was watching. You won't believe how this story ends. So stay with me. And when you've heard it all, share it. Because someone out there needs to know they're not alone. Rachel stepped out of the little bakery on Main Street, a white paper bag in one hand and her car keys in the other. The warm scent of fresh cinnamon rolls lingered in the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Her long beige coat moved gently with the early autumn breeze, and the soft click of her heels on the sidewalk echoed a rhythm that was part of her everyday life. She'd just picked up some pastries to surprise her sister before heading home. The late afternoon sun cast golden shadows on the pavement, and a faint smile curled at the edge of her lips. She was 48, graceful and soft-spoken, with a kind face that strangers often found comforting. Her hair, tied back neatly in a low bun, still had streaks of golden brown, though the silver strands had begun to peek through in recent years. She looked like someone who didn't like causing trouble, and she wasn't. But trouble, that day, came looking for her. "Ma'am." The sharp voice came from behind her, breaking the stillness. Rachel turned to see two police officers approaching quickly. One was tall, heavy-set, with a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. The name on his chest said Whitaker, Officer James Whitaker. The other man was younger, clean-shaven, with nervous eyes that shifted away when she met them. His badge read Reed. Rachel blinked. "Yes?" Officer Whitaker didn't slow down. He stepped right up to her, towering over her by nearly a foot. "We've had a report of a theft in this area," he said, his tone flat, eyes cold. "Need to check your bag." Rachel glanced down at her paper bag, then up again. I just came from the bakery," she said. "I'm not involved in any theft." "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue with you. We're checking everyone." His voice didn't rise, but the way he spoke sent a chill through her. It wasn't a request. "I understand," she said carefully, trying to keep calm. "But you can't just search me without cause. I haven't done anything wrong." Whitaker took a step closer, close enough that she could smell his aftershave. "You want to do this the hard way?" The younger officer, Reed, opened his mouth, but Whitaker gave him a sharp look and he fell silent. Rachel looked around. A few people were walking by, glancing curiously, but no one stopped. No one said a word. "I'll go to the station with you," Rachel offered. Her voice trembled just a little. "You can ask me questions there. I'm not resisting." "You don't get to decide how this goes," Whitaker said. And before she could react, he reached forward and yanked the bag from her hand, tearing it open. The cinnamon rolls tumbled out onto the sidewalk, smearing icing across the pavement. "Hey!" Rachel gasped, reaching for the bag, but Whitaker pushed her hand away. "That's my food." Whitaker looked inside, grunted, then tossed the torn bag at her feet. "Nothing. Still need to check you." Rachel took a step back, feeling panic bubble in her chest. No, you've already searched the bag. That's enough. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, stop resisting. He crouched, and to her horror, his hand grabbed the hem of her coat and tugged it upward. She slapped his arm, gasping, "Stop. What are you doing?" Whitaker stood again, gripping her wrist. You want to be arrested for assaulting an officer? Rachel's heart pounded in her ears. She tried to step away, but he pulled at her coat again, this time lifting it high enough to expose her legs and the bottom of her dress. No, stop it, she cried, struggling to pull her coat back down. A small group of bystanders had gathered now. They watched with wide eyes, murmuring among themselves. An older woman across the street clutched her purse to her chest. What's she hiding? She whispered to the man beside her. I don't know, he said, but it's not our business. Rachel's face burned. Humiliation swept over her like fire. She felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally, stripped of her dignity in front of strangers. This is wrong, she shouted at Whitaker. You're violating my rights. The younger officer, Reed, shifted uneasily. Maybe we should. Shut up, Whitaker snapped. She's hiding something. Rachel could hardly speak. Her voice shook with rage. You're abusing your badge. Whitaker leaned in, close enough that she could feel his breath. Lady, I'm keeping the streets safe. You don't like it, you can take it up with the department. And then he let her go, smirking as he turned to the gathering crowd. Nothing to see here, he barked. Move along. Rachel stood frozen. Her legs felt like they might give out. Her coat was still rumpled around her knees, her heart beating so loud it drowned out the traffic nearby. She bent down slowly to pick up the crushed bakery bag, icing now smeared across the paper. Reed hesitated, then followed Whitaker down the block. Rachel didn't move for a long time. Her hands shook as she tried to brush off her coat. People were still staring. She didn't even know if she was crying. Her face felt hot and wet, but it might have just been the cold wind. When she finally gathered herself enough to walk, her steps were uneven. Her car was parked around the corner, and every step felt heavier than the last. She got in, closed the door, and sat there with her hands on the wheel. She didn't drive. Not at first. She stared straight ahead, the words he'd said echoing in her mind. You want to be arrested for assaulting an officer? You don't get to decide how this goes. She'd done nothing wrong. Nothing. And yet, she felt like a criminal. Worse, she felt invisible. Not one person had stepped forward. Not one voice had said stop. She took a shaky breath and started the engine. The drive home blurred past her. When she pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. Her sister, Janice, was sitting on the steps, arms crossed to keep warm. You okay? Janice asked, standing up as Rachel climbed out of the car. You're late. Rachel didn't answer. She walked straight into the house and placed the crumpled bag on the kitchen counter. Janice followed her in, looking concerned. Rachel? What happened? Rachel turned to her, her voice barely above a whisper. The police, they stopped me. Janice's eyes widened. What? Why? They said there was a theft. They thought I was involved. Or pretended to. I don't know. Her voice cracked, and she looked away. Janice reached for her arm. Did they hurt you? Rachel nodded slowly, tears falling now. He lifted my coat. In front of people. Tore open the bag. Pulled it up like I was nothing. Janice's face turned red with anger. He what? Are you serious? That's assault, Rachel. That's abuse. You have to report this. Rachel sat down at the kitchen table, her whole body sagging. Who would believe me? He's a police officer. I'm just me. Janice crouched beside her. You're not just anything. You're Rachel. You didn't do anything wrong. We're not letting him get away with this. Rachel looked at her sister and gave a broken laugh. I thought someone might help. Just one person. But everyone watched like I deserved it. Janice stood up, fire in her eyes. Then we'll be the ones who speak. We'll find someone who will listen. Rachel didn't respond, but she didn't protest either. Deep down, something inside her stirred, some small ember of strength, buried under layers of humiliation. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew one thing for certain. Officer James Whitaker had taken something from her that day. But she wasn't going to let him keep it. That night, Rachel didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the afternoon played over and over in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Whitaker's face, the coldness in his eyes, the way his hand gripped her coat, the smirk on his lips when he saw her shame. She could still feel the stares of the people around her. The silence of strangers hurt more than the roughness of his hands. No one had spoken up. No one had stepped in. And now, even in her own home, she felt like the walls were pressing in on her. Janice had tried to comfort her, but Rachel had barely spoken. How could she explain the feeling of being stripped of her dignity in front of a dozen people, like she was nothing more than a suspect, someone unworthy of decency? The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains. Rachel sat at the kitchen table in a robe, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. Janice was pacing the kitchen. I did some reading last night, Janice said, her voice tight with controlled anger. There's a way to file a complaint. You don't have to go to the station, you can call the Civilian Review Board. It's anonymous if you want it to be. Rachel said nothing at first. Her eyes were tired and red, and her shoulders slumped. He told me to take it up with the department, she said finally. He dared me to. Janice stopped pacing and knelt beside her. So let's do it. Let's call. Right now. Rachel looked at her sister, then slowly shook her head. It won't matter. He'll deny it. They'll say he was following protocol. And even if they believed me, what then? He's still out there, still wearing that badge. Janice sighed, rubbing her temples. You're right. He probably thinks you're just going to let it go. That's what they count on to fear. Silence. Rachel bit her lip and stared out the window. The trees in the yard were beginning to shed their leaves, like the season was quietly letting go of things it could no longer carry. I've never felt so small, she said softly. Not even when Michael left. That hurt, sure, but this was different. He made me feel invisible. Less than human. Janice's expression softened. She sat across from Rachel and reached across the table to hold her hand. You're not invisible. And you're not alone. But if you don't speak up, he'll keep doing this to someone else. That truth settled over Rachel like a heavy coat. She hadn't thought much beyond her own pain. But now she pictured another woman on that street. Another coat lifted. Another crowd doing nothing. I want to speak up, she whispered. I do. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Janice squeezed her hand. You are. Later that day, Rachel sat in front of her old computer, staring at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. She opened a blank document. Then slowly, hesitantly, she began to type. She wrote everything she remembered. The time she left the bakery. What she was wearing. The color of Whitaker's eyes. The way his hand felt on her wrist. She described the bag being ripped from her hand, the cinnamon rolls on the ground, the stares from the crowd. The shame. The helplessness. She stopped several times to wipe her tears, but she kept writing. When she was done, she saved the document under the name Truth. That night, she printed it out and placed it on the kitchen counter. Janice found it the next morning and read every word. This is powerful, Rachel, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You don't need to file a complaint yet. But this is your story. No one can take that away from you. Rachel nodded. I just needed to see it written down. To know it really happened. A few days passed. Rachel returned to her routine, though something inside her had shifted. She still walked to the bakery, but her steps were slower. She wore sunglasses even when it wasn't sunny. And every time she saw a patrol car, her stomach twisted into knots. Then one morning, Janice handed her a small flyer. I picked this up at the library, she said. There's a support group that meets every Thursday at the community center. It's for women who've experienced harassment or abuse. You don't have to talk. You can just sit and listen. Rachel stared at the paper. Her first instinct was to say no. But something stopped her. Thursday evening, she walked into the community center, her heart pounding. The room was small, with a circle of folding chairs and a table in the corner with coffee and cookies. There were about a dozen women there, some young, some older, all sitting quietly. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a denim jacket welcomed her. I'm Mary, she said gently. You're welcome here. No pressure to speak. Rachel nodded and took a seat. She listened as the women shared pieces of their stories, some about harassment at work, others about being ignored by the very people meant to protect them. No one told her what to do. No one rushed her. Just being there, hearing their voices, made her feel a little less alone. At the end of the meeting, Mary handed her a small card. On it was the name of a local legal advocate, someone who had helped other women file complaints and navigate the system. If you ever decide you want to talk, Mary said, she's a good place to start. Rachel held onto that card like it was something sacred. Later that night, she sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the chill in the air was sharp. But for the first time since that terrible day, she felt something warm flicker in her chest. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But she had spoken, if only to herself, to her sister, to a circle of strangers who somehow understood. It was small. But it was a beginning. The following week, Officer James Whitaker stood at the corner of Elm and Grove, arms crossed as he scanned the street with that same cold stare he always wore. His partner, Officer Ben Reed, leaned against the patrol car with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around a lukewarm coffee. The afternoon had been uneventful so far, just a few parking violations and a minor fender bender outside the post office. But James seemed agitated, restless in the way predators sometimes are before they strike. Ben noticed it, but didn't say a word. Let's walk the block, James said suddenly, tossing his empty coffee cup into the back seat of the cruiser. Ben followed without argument. The two officers strolled down Grove Street, past the quiet storefronts and the library with its wide front steps. It was just past school dismissal, and the sidewalks were beginning to fill with people, mothers picking up children, older folks walking dogs, teens in hoodies slouching along. That's when James saw her. A young woman sitting alone at a bus stop, her backpack resting beside her and her eyes fixed on her phone. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her black hair was pulled into a bun, and she wore a red flannel shirt over jeans. She looked tired, maybe even a little nervous, like she was hoping the bus would come faster than usual. James didn't hesitate. Let's check her, he said flatly. Ben's eyes shifted toward the girl. For what? James gave him a look. Suspicious behavior. You see her glancing around like that? Ben didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but he nodded slowly. All right. They crossed the street. The girl looked up as the shadow of the two officers fell over her. Evening, miss, James said, his voice cold but controlled. We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind if we ask you a few questions? The girl blinked, startled. Sure, I guess. Is something wrong? James didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer. Let's see some ID, he said. The girl reached into her bag, fumbling nervously. I think I have it, just a sec. James snatched the bag from her lap before she could find it. Hey, she said, alarmed. "That's my bag." "Calm down," James barked. "Standard check." Ben shifted uncomfortably behind him, watching the young woman's face turn pale. She stood up, reaching toward James, but he shoved the bag into her chest. "Hold still," he ordered. "Raise your hands." She hesitated, confused and scared. "Now." Her hands rose instinctively, and in that moment, James grabbed her shoulder and tugged the front of her flannel shirt open just enough to expose her collarbone and the strap of her tank top beneath. "Stop," she cried, yanking herself away. A few books and personal items tumbled from her open bag, scattering onto the sidewalk. Ben took a half step forward. "James, maybe we." James shot him a glare. "Stay out of it." The girl crouched down to gather her things, her hands trembling. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice cracking. James didn't respond. He just tossed her bag onto the bench and turned away. "Keep your ID handy next time," he said coldly. "You never know when someone's watching." The young woman didn't move for a while. She stayed there, crouched on the ground, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. Ben followed James back toward the car, but something in him had started to twist. As they got in, James smirked. Kids these days, they all think they're above suspicion. Ben didn't respond. He stared out the window as the engine hummed beneath them. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't quite take a deep breath. He remembered Rachel, the woman from last week. The way she'd stood there, stunned, her coat crumpled around her knees. He remembered how James had grabbed her, lifted her skirt like she was nothing. And now this young woman. What was her name? Where was she headed? Would she tell someone what happened? Or would she, like Rachel, go home and cry alone? Ben swallowed hard. "Something bothering you?" James asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "No," Ben lied, his voice low. Back at the station, Ben lingered in the locker room longer than usual. He sat on the bench, elbows resting on his knees, head in his hands. He couldn't shake the image of that girl, her frightened eyes, the way her voice cracked when she said she hadn't done anything. She hadn't. And neither had Rachel. Neither had the others. But James didn't seem to care. He acted like every person who crossed his path was guilty until proven innocent, and even then, only barely. Ben had joined the force 5 years ago, right out of community college. He believed in protecting people, standing up for what was right. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped standing at all. Every time he said nothing, every time he looked the other way, he'd felt himself shrinking. He thought about reporting James more than once. But James wasn't just another cop. He had friends in high places. The captain liked him. The lieutenant gave him room to do what he needed to do. Everyone knew James had a temper, but no one challenged him. And Ben? He wasn't married. Had no family in town. His paycheck was his lifeline. He knew how it would go. He'd file a report, and suddenly he'd be reassigned. Or watched. Or pressured to quit. And James would make sure of it. Still, that night, as Ben sat in his car in the grocery store parking lot, he found himself pulling out his phone and typing the words "police officer abuse of power who to report" into the search bar. He didn't press send. But the search sat there, glowing on the screen, for a long time. Meanwhile, the young woman from the bus stop, her name was Emily Torres, sat at her kitchen table, crying quietly into a crumpled tissue. Her mother, who barely spoke English, hovered nearby, not sure what had happened, only that her daughter had come home shaken and pale. Emily hadn't told her the truth, not all of it. She just said a police officer had stopped her, checked her bag, asked some questions. Nothing serious. But it had felt serious. It had felt violating. Wrong. And the worst part? She didn't know what to do about it. She didn't know who would believe her, or if anyone would even care. She thought about it as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the way Rachel had not long ago. And just like Rachel, Emily didn't sleep. The phone sat on the kitchen counter like it might bite her. Rachel stared at it, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. For the 5th time that morning, she picked it up, and for the 5th time, she set it back down. She'd read the little card Mary had given her, more times than she could count. The words were simple: Women's Advocacy Network, here to listen. Here to help. A name was written neatly in blue ink, Jill Harmon, with a number underneath. Rachel rubbed her arms and paced. Janice had gone to work already, but before she left, she'd kissed Rachel's cheek and said, "Make the call. You're ready. Even if you don't feel like it." Rachel wasn't sure she'd ever feel ready. But something in her wouldn't let it go. Finally, she picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a kind voice answered. Women's Advocacy Network. This is Jill speaking. How can I help you? Rachel hesitated. Her mouth felt dry. Hi, my name is Rachel Whitmore. Something happened to me. A police officer. The line was quiet for just a moment, then Jill's voice came again, calm and reassuring. Thank you for calling, Rachel. You're safe here. Can you tell me what happened? Rachel sat down at the table and closed her eyes. The words didn't come easily, but Jill didn't rush her. She let Rachel speak in her own time, gently asking questions only when Rachel stopped. I was stopped, Rachel said, her voice trembling. By an officer. His name was James Whitaker. He said there'd been a theft, but I hadn't done anything. He took my bag, ripped it open. Then, he lifted my coat. In front of everyone. Rachel's voice cracked. She felt her throat close up. She was crying before she even realized it. Jill didn't interrupt. She just listened. When Rachel finished, Jill spoke softly. Rachel, I'm so sorry. What you experienced was not okay. It was a violation of your rights and your dignity. You didn't deserve that. Rachel let out a shaky breath. I keep telling myself to let it go. But then I see him in my head. Hear his voice. It's not something you can just forget, Jill said gently. And you don't have to go through this alone. We're here to help, legally, emotionally, whatever you need. Rachel sat very still. I don't know if I can file a report, she said. I mean, it's his word against mine, isn't it? And he's the one with the badge. Jill paused for a moment before responding. You're not the first person to say that. But that's why we exist. To level the ground a little. If you'd be willing to meet with me, we can talk about your options, what you're comfortable with. No pressure. Rachel nodded slowly, even though Jill couldn't see her. Yes, she whispered. I think I need that. They set a meeting for the next day at the local community outreach center. Rachel spent that night barely sleeping, but for the first time, it wasn't just fear keeping her awake. It was something else, something that felt almost like resolve. The next afternoon, Rachel walked into the center wearing a navy sweater and soft gray slacks. She clutched her handbag a little too tightly, her palms damp with nervous sweat. She was greeted in the lobby by a woman with warm eyes and silver-streaked brown hair. Rachel, the woman asked with a smile. I'm Jill. I'm so glad you came. Rachel relaxed just a little. Jill looked more like a favorite schoolteacher than a legal advocate, soft around the edges, kind but sharp behind the eyes. She led Rachel to a quiet room in the back, away from the noise of the main office. Over the next hour, Rachel shared her story again, this time with more detail, more honesty. She talked about the bakery, the crowd, the shame. Jill took notes quietly but mostly listened, nodding gently as Rachel spoke. When Rachel was done, Jill leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. I want to tell you something, Rachel. What Officer Whitaker did to you wasn't just cruel, it may be criminal. There are legal channels we can explore. But only if you want to. You have control here. We don't rush victims into action. We support them in whatever they choose. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I don't even know where to start. That's okay, Jill said with a soft smile. We start with your story. Then we gather information. If you decide to file a complaint, we'll be right beside you. And if not, we're still here. Rachel hesitated. Would anyone else speak out? If he's done this to me, has he done it to others? Jill's expression darkened just a little. That's something we're beginning to wonder ourselves. Your case isn't the first time we've heard that name. Nothing solid yet, but you may not be alone. The word sent a ripple through Rachel's chest. Not alone. She'd clung to that hope for days, and now it felt real. Is there someone I can talk to? Rachel asked. Someone else who's been through something like this? Jill nodded. Yes. If they're comfortable, we can connect you. And we're also working with a legal advocate. Her name is Nora. She's been in this field for over 20 years. Would you be willing to meet with her? Rachel nodded. Yes. I think so. Before she left the center, Jill handed her a folder filled with helpful resources, support group contacts, and a business card with both Jill's and Nora's names. Rachel took it all home and laid the folder on her kitchen table. Janice walked in not long after. You did it? She asked, seeing the papers. Rachel gave a small smile. I did. And I'm going back. Janice walked over and wrapped her arms around her sister. I'm proud of you, she whispered. So proud. Rachel didn't say anything, but her eyes shimmered with quiet tears. She felt something she hadn't felt since the day it happened, like she might actually heal. That night, she sat by the window, the folder still in her lap. She didn't open it again just yet. She just held it. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that she was doing something. Proof that she wasn't invisible anymore. Daniel Whitmore knew his wife better than anyone. And when Rachel walked through the door that afternoon, something in her had changed. She still looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her shoulders not quite relaxed, but there was a flicker of steadiness behind her words. A small anchor, firming up beneath the grief. She told him about the meeting with Jill. About the Women's Center. About how someone had finally said, "You didn't deserve that." And Daniel just listened, nodding gently, knowing it had taken everything she had just to make that call. Later that evening, Rachel sat on the couch with a blanket around her, sipping tea as the television played quietly. Daniel excused himself, kissed her on the forehead, and walked into his study. He didn't say why. But Rachel could tell something was stirring in him too. He closed the door behind him and turned on the small desk lamp, illuminating the corner of the room where his old laptop sat, humming to life. Daniel wasn't a tech-savvy man. He still printed his bills and filed them in manila folders. But tonight, he was going to learn whatever he had to. He opened a browser and sat still for a long moment, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, he typed. Police officer abuse of power Newberry. Pages of search results blinked to life. Most were news headlines, none related. A few law blogs, a county policy page, a hotline number for citizen complaints. He tried again. Women harassed by officer in Newberry. Still nothing specific. Frustrated, he narrowed it down further. Police officer James Whitaker misconduct. Nothing. Daniel sighed and rubbed his temples. It wasn't that he'd expected a confession online, but the silence felt eerily familiar, like the way everyone on the sidewalk had stayed quiet when Rachel cried for help. Still, he pressed on. He clicked into a local message board, one of those old-school community forums where residents posted about everything from school fundraisers to suspicious cars in the neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. Real. And buried on page 2 of a discussion titled Feeling Unsafe in Our Own Town, he saw it. A post from a woman named Kayla T., written 3 months ago. The subject line read, Stopped by officer, felt violated. Daniel's pulse quickened. He clicked the post and read, "I'm not trying to stir anything up. I just need to say it somewhere. I was walking home from work, same route I've taken for years, and a police officer pulled over and said I matched the description. I was wearing slacks and a name tag from the diner. He made me empty my purse on the sidewalk. I kept asking what I was being accused of, and he wouldn't answer. When I tried to pick up my things, he told me to keep my hands where he could see them. I've never felt so humiliated in my life. I didn't file a complaint. Who would believe me over a cop?" Daniel sat back in his chair, heart thudding. He read the post again, then copied Kayla's username and sent her a message through the forum. "Hello Kayla, I read your post. My name is Daniel. My wife experienced something very similar with the same officer, though your post didn't mention his name. If you're open to talking, I'd be very grateful." He signed it politely and clicked send. The next morning, he got a reply. "Hi Daniel. I don't usually answer messages like this. But, yeah, I'll talk." They arranged to meet the next afternoon at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. When Daniel arrived, Kayla was already there, seated in a corner booth with a cup of coffee clasped between both hands. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a faded work polo and a pair of jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her eyes scanned the door with caution. Daniel approached slowly. "Kayla?" She nodded. "I'm Daniel Whitmore. Thank you for meeting me." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that settles when people carry too much weight inside. Then she spoke. "I don't usually talk about it. My boyfriend says I'm overreacting. Said the officer was probably just doing his job." She looked down into her coffee. "But I know what it felt like." Daniel nodded gently. "My wife was stopped by Officer James Whitaker. Publicly. He lifted her coat in front of a crowd. Treated her like a criminal." Kayla's eyes snapped up. "James Whitaker," she said. "That was him. He never said his name. But I remember his face. Tall. Square jaw. Talks like he's always right." Daniel took a deep breath. "You're not alone." Rachel felt like no one would believe her. But then she got help through the Women's Advocacy Network. They listened. Kayla sat back. "Is she filing a complaint?" "She's thinking about it. But we're gathering support first." Other voices. "You don't have to testify or do anything you're uncomfortable with. But talking to someone at the network could help." Kayla was quiet, then finally said, "If it means he won't do it to someone else, then yeah. I'll talk to them." Daniel left the diner with a sense of purpose. He wasn't just helping Rachel anymore, he was lifting the curtain on something much bigger. That evening, after dinner, Rachel sat beside him at the table as he shared what had happened. She remembered his face, Daniel said, and the way he treated her. The shame. The fear. Rachel swallowed hard. "It's like hearing my own story." She agreed to speak with the advocacy group, Daniel added. "If more come forward, it'll help your case." Rachel nodded. "Thank you for doing this." "I'll keep going," Daniel said softly, "until we find them all." And he did. The next night, back at his laptop, Daniel browsed another thread, this one on a neighborhood Facebook group. It took some digging, but one post stood out. A woman named Caroline J., who worked at a grocery store downtown, had written, "Why do some cops think a uniform gives them a free pass to treat people like dirt? I got stopped leaving work, and the officer searched me in front of customers. Said I looked suspicious. Never been more embarrassed." Daniel reached out again. "Caroline, my name is Daniel. I'm looking into incidents involving Officer Whitaker. I believe he's the one who mistreated you. My wife is one of his victims too. If you're willing to talk, I'd be grateful." Caroline replied the next day. They met at a quiet cafe off the main road. Caroline was in her 40s, dressed neatly in a floral blouse and cardigan. She had a weary kindness about her, the kind that came from years of customer service and swallowing disrespect. "I didn't want to say anything," she admitted. "I thought maybe I misunderstood. But when you said your wife went through something too, it made me think. Maybe I wasn't crazy." "You're not," Daniel said. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Caroline bit her lip. "He opened my purse, dumped it out right on the pavement in front of my coworkers. Then he asked if I had anything under my shirt. It was humiliating." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Would you speak with someone from the advocacy group? Even off the record?" Caroline looked down at her coffee, then slowly nodded. "Yeah. I think it's time." Back home, Daniel added her name to the list. Rachel sat across from him, watching quietly. "How do you do it?" she asked. "You're so calm." "I'm not," he said honestly. "Every story makes me want to scream. But I keep thinking about how you felt that day. Alone. Powerless. If these women can take that back, even just a little, it's worth it." Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. "You're fighting for me." "I'm fighting with you," he said. The next week, the advocacy group scheduled meetings with both Kayla and Caroline. Rachel sat in on Caroline's, holding her hand as she recounted the story. It was painful, but powerful. The connection between the women, unspoken but deep, gave them strength. Daniel kept digging. And one night, just after 10, he got an email from a woman named Teresa M. She'd read one of his posts and said her teenage daughter had been stopped while walking home from school. He said she matched the description, the message read. "She's 15. He made her show him the contents of her backpack. He told her not to tell anyone." Daniel felt something heavy and cold settle in his stomach. 15. He replied immediately. Teresa and her daughter met with the advocacy team the next day. The list was growing. The stories were chilling. But the silence? That was finally beginning to crack. And Daniel? He wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. Officer Ben Reed stood at the sink in the station break room, watching the weak stream of coffee drip into his paper cup. The overhead light buzzed softly, and the hum of printers and quiet radio chatter filled the halls behind him. He'd been standing there for 10 minutes, long after the coffee finished brewing, but his hand still trembled slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. His chest felt tight. Too tight. It had been 2 weeks since the day James Whitaker lifted a woman's coat in the middle of Main Street, in front of strangers, like she was an object, not a person. Ben had told himself it was a misunderstanding. He'd told himself James was following protocol, keeping the public safe. But those excuses had thinned with every passing day. Now they were paper. And they were burning. The worst part? It wasn't just Rachel anymore. Ben had seen him do it again. With that girl at the bus stop, Emily, she said her name was. He hadn't touched her in quite the same way, but the look in her eyes had been the same, frightened, exposed. She had tried to be polite. She had tried to keep her voice steady. But James had made sure to leave her shaken and silent. And Ben had stood there. He had said nothing. That silence haunted him more than the abuse itself. He walked slowly to his desk, sat down, and stared at the computer screen. His inbox was full, but he didn't see the messages. All he could see was Rachel's face, that look of humiliation and disbelief after James yanked her coat. Ben hadn't been close enough to intervene that day, but he'd heard about it almost immediately. The whispers had traveled through the precinct like wind through trees. No one had said much. Just shrugged. She probably overreacted. Whitaker's just doing his job. People love to cry wolf these days. But Ben hadn't shrugged. Because he knew better. He knew James had a pattern. A method. A sickness, maybe. He never beat people. Never left bruises. No body cameras, no written reports. Just small humiliations, carefully chosen, impossible to prove. Ben had started keeping a notebook. Nothing official, just a small, battered pad he tucked into his jacket pocket. Every time James crossed a line, Ben jotted it down. He wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the thought that someday someone might ask, and he'd have something real to say. But the list was growing now. 10 names. 10 incidents. 10 moments that made his stomach turn. And he couldn't do it anymore. He stood and made his way down the hallway to the locker room. He needed space. Quiet. A place where the noise in his head wouldn't be drowned out by keyboards and small talk. Inside, he found Officer Rick Taylor sitting on the bench, tying his boots. Rick was older, near retirement. A fatherly figure in the department, the kind who still believed in right and wrong. Ben sat across from him without saying anything. Rick looked up. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Ben rubbed the back of his neck. "I haven't, really." Rick waited. Let the silence settle. Finally, Ben spoke. "It's about James." Rick didn't flinch. Just nodded slowly. "Go on." Ben hesitated, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He's hurting people, Rick. Humiliating them. Women. Always women. He hides behind that badge like it makes him untouchable." Rick exhaled, a long, tired breath. "You've seen it?" "Too many times," Ben said. "I wrote them down. Every time I watched him do something I knew wasn't right. Every time I didn't stop him." Rick studied him. "Why are you telling me now?" Ben swallowed hard. "Because I can't live with myself anymore. I joined this job to help people. Protect them. But I've been protecting a man who breaks people down for sport. And I think one of his victims, Rachel Whitmore, she's coming forward. There's a lawyer involved. Others too, maybe." Rick nodded. "So what are you going to do?" Ben looked him in the eyes. "Tell the truth." Rick gave a slow, approving nod. "Then do it, son. But do it right. Keep records. Keep your head down until you're ready. When the time comes, you'll need someone to stand with you. You'll have me." That night, Ben couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't dread keeping him awake, it was decision. A cold, steady fire in his chest. He found the card tucked between the pages of a phone directory in his kitchen drawer. One of the women he'd helped during a dispute call had left it behind by accident. It was from a group called the Women's Advocacy Network. He remembered seeing it then, thinking nothing of it. Now he thought everything of it. He sat at his kitchen table and dialed the number. Women's Advocacy Network. "This is Jill," came the voice on the other end. Ben cleared his throat. "Hi. My name's Ben Reed. I'm a police officer in Newberry. I've been working with Officer James Whitaker for the past 4 years. I think I have information you need." There was a pause, but Jill's voice was calm. "All right, Ben. Can you tell me what this is about?" He exhaled shakily. "He's been abusing his power. Over and over again. And I've stayed quiet. I can't anymore. I've kept notes. Names. Dates. I want to talk to someone. Off the record, for now." "We can arrange that," Jill said. "We'll keep your identity confidential. Would you be willing to meet in person?" "Yes," Ben said. "Please." They agreed on a time and place, an old library branch turned community office on the edge of town. Neutral ground. The next afternoon, Ben arrived early. He wore plain clothes, jeans, and a navy jacket, and kept his head down as he walked inside. Jill greeted him with a warm smile and introduced him to Nora, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. They sat in a quiet room with no windows, just a soft lamp on the table. Ben placed his notebook on the table. I wrote everything down. Every incident I witnessed, every time he crossed the line. Nora opened the notebook carefully, flipping through the pages. This is detailed, she said. Have you ever spoken to your supervisors about this? Ben shook his head. They won't believe me. Or worse, they'll turn it around. James has friends in high places. I'd be suspended. Maybe worse. But if there's a case already forming, I want to be part of it. There is, Jill said gently. Rachel Whitmore is one of our clients. Her husband has found other victims. They're preparing to testify. Ben's breath caught. Then it's real. I was afraid no one would come forward. They have, Nora said. And your testimony could change everything. Ben nodded. Then I'll do it. I'll testify. Whatever it takes. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Ben recounted each moment, the look in Rachel's eyes, the silence of onlookers, the way James always seemed to choose women alone. How he used just enough authority to avoid attention, but too much to ignore. When the meeting ended, Ben stepped outside into the cool air and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. It wasn't peace. That would come later, if at all. But for the first time in years, he'd done something right. Back at home, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the dust settle outside the window. His phone buzzed. A text from Jill. Thank you for today. You made a difference. Ben smiled faintly and looked at the notebook resting on the table beside him. He placed his hand over it, not to hide it, but to protect it. Tomorrow would come, and he'd be ready to stand. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, her arms folded across her chest, watching the trees sway in the wind. Autumn had come in slow and golden, but the breeze today felt different, sharper, brisker, like something was about to shift. She could feel it in her bones. Behind her, Daniel sat at the table, flipping through pages of a manila folder. Notes, contact sheets, emails, all neatly organized. He looked up every so often, watching Rachel in the silence. He didn't speak right away. He knew she was trying to hold herself steady. Then, gently, he said, "There's something I think you should see." She turned around. He slid a folded newspaper across the table. Rachel's eyes landed on the headline, "Local officer accused of abusing power, victim step forward." She held her breath as she opened the paper and saw it, her story, written with care and caution, her name kept anonymous. But the description, it was hers. The cinnamon rolls, the sidewalk, the lifted coat, the shame. And then, others. Caroline. Kayla. Even Teresa, whose daughter was only 15. Their stories followed hers like echoes, each one different, but tied together by the same cold thread. A photograph accompanied the article. Not of her or the victims, but of Officer James Whitaker, walking down Main Street, expression blank. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Facing serious allegations." Rachel stared at the page, her fingers trembling. "Where did this come from?" she whispered. "Helen," Daniel said. She spoke to a reporter at El Progreso, through someone at the women's rights organization. They promised discretion until the case goes to court. But the public needed to know. Rachel kept staring at the newspaper. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "People will know what he did. What he's been doing all along." Daniel nodded. "It's out there now. It's real." She folded the paper gently, hand still unsteady. "Do you think they'll believe it?" Daniel got up and walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "They already do. You're not the only one anymore." That day, the article spread. First on local news sites. Then through social media. It wasn't a headline on national TV, but in Newberry, it was everything. People whispered in grocery store aisles. Customers asked quiet questions at the coffee shop. Workers at City Hall exchanged looks as the article made its rounds. And at the police station, the air changed. Officer James Whitaker walked in with his usual confident stride, but the room didn't greet him the same way. Conversation stopped when he passed. Eyes dropped or flicked away. Some colleagues still nodded politely, but the tone was different, strained, uncertain. Even the captain, who usually greeted James with casual camaraderie, gave only a curt nod that morning. James tossed the newspaper onto his desk and stared at it, jaw tight. "This is garbage," he muttered. "Lies. They're trying to smear me." Ben sat across the room, pretending to review case files. He didn't look up, didn't speak. But his heart pounded in his chest. The dominoes were starting to fall. Slowly, but surely. James picked up the phone, dialed quickly, and barked, "You see this nonsense? We need to shut it down. Now." But the voices on the other end couldn't fix what was already in motion. Meanwhile, at the Women's Advocacy Office, phones rang constantly. People were calling in, some to offer support, others to ask questions. A few were angry, insisting the article was exaggerated. But more often than not, they were survivors. Quiet voices. Hesitant but hopeful. I think that might have been the same officer who stopped me. I never said anything, but I remember how he made me feel. I didn't think I had a story until I read hers. Jill and Nora worked late into the night, taking down statements, offering referrals, connecting people with legal help. At the center of it all, Rachel sat with Caroline, Kayla, and Teresa in the conference room. There was a silence among them, but not an empty one. It was the silence of shared truth. Caroline spoke first. "I thought I was the only one. For so long, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. That maybe I'd imagined it." "You didn't," Rachel said. "None of us did." Kayla leaned forward. "He picked us because he thought we'd stay quiet. That no one would care." Rachel nodded. "He was wrong." The women looked around at one another. Different ages. Different lives. But bound now by courage, and by something deeper, a vow to be seen, heard, and believed. Later that afternoon, Rachel and Daniel walked through town together. They didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to get some air, feel the world beyond the walls of meeting rooms and newsprint. At one point, a woman stopped them on the sidewalk. She was older, maybe in her 70s, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun under a knit cap. "You're Rachel, aren't you?" she asked softly. Rachel hesitated. "Yes." The woman nodded. "I read the story. I just want you to know, you're brave. What you did. It matters." Rachel's eyes welled. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was never brave enough to say anything," the woman added, voice catching. "But maybe now, maybe more of us will." Rachel nodded, unable to speak. As they walked away, Daniel slipped his arm around her waist. "It's working," he said. "Piece by piece." Back at the station, Ben pulled out his phone during his break and scrolled through the article again. He reread every line, pausing on the part about the anonymous officer who had come forward with internal notes. That was him. The notebook he had shared was now a key part of the case. He hadn't given his name yet, not to the public, but it wouldn't be long. And strangely, that didn't scare him anymore. Rick walked into the break room and gave Ben a quiet nod. "It's a storm," he said. "But it's the right storm." Ben nodded back. "It's about time someone faced it." And in another corner of town, at the high school where Teresa's daughter attended, a guidance counselor quietly slipped her a note at the end of the day. It read, "You're brave. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." She tucked it into her backpack and smiled, just a little. The truth was spreading. One voice had become 5. 5 had become 10. And James Whitaker? He was no longer untouchable. His badge, once a shield, now weighed heavier each day. And Rachel? Rachel was no longer just a victim. She was the reason it had all begun. The courthouse stood at the center of town, an old stone building with wide marble steps and pillars that seemed to reach for the sky. For most of her life, Rachel had driven past it without a second thought. But now, as she stood at its base, looking up, it seemed larger than ever, like a mountain she was being asked to climb. The wind tugged gently at her coat. Daniel stood beside her, one hand on her back, grounding her. Jill and Nora approached from the parking lot, carrying folders and files and the weight of many women's voices. "This is the first hearing," Nora said, her tone gentle but steady. "They'll review the complaint and decide if the case moves forward. It won't be the last time you're in this building." Rachel nodded. Her hands trembled slightly, but her jaw was set. "I'm ready." Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy and still. Wooden benches lined the walls, and every creak of the floor echoed like thunder. Rachel sat beside Daniel, her knees touching his. Across the room, the door opened, and in walked James Whitaker. He looked different than before. His uniform was replaced with a navy suit, too crisp, too polished. But his expression hadn't changed. Arrogant. Cold. He glanced around the courtroom as if he owned it, and when his eyes landed on Rachel, they narrowed ever so slightly. Behind him trailed his attorney, a sharp-faced man named Vernon Blake, known around town for taking on tough cases and for winning. James had brought in the big guns. Rachel turned away, her heart pounding. "He won't shake you," Daniel whispered. "I know," she said. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared." Vernon Blake took his seat and began speaking to James in hushed tones. James nodded slowly, arms crossed, glancing at the judge's bench as the bailiff entered the room. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Madeline Foster presiding." Everyone stood. Judge Foster entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes that missed nothing. She took her seat, glanced briefly at the paperwork before her, and tapped her gavel. "This hearing is in regard to civil complaint number 2311, filed by Ms. Rachel Whitmore and co-complainants Caroline Jensen, Kayla Turner, Teresa Martinez, and minor Jane Martinez, against Officer James Whitaker of the Newberry Police Department. Allegations include abuse of power, unlawful search, and public humiliation." Her voice was steady and unemotional, but Rachel's heart was racing. Nora rose to her feet. "Your Honor, we are prepared to submit detailed statements, sworn affidavits, and supporting documents outlining a consistent pattern of misconduct by Officer Whitaker. Each of our clients was subjected to invasive and degrading treatment under the guise of law enforcement." Vernon Blake stood calmly. "Your Honor, we intend to challenge the merit of these claims." The officer in question acted within the scope of his duties. Any suggestion otherwise is a misinterpretation of lawful policing procedures. These are emotionally charged accusations, not legal violations. Judge Foster raised an eyebrow. "I will be the one to determine that, Mr. Blake. Let's proceed." One by one, Nora introduced the witness summaries and key points of the complaint. She didn't dramatize. She didn't raise her voice. She let the facts speak. Each woman's experience, different in setting, identical in feeling. Shame. Helplessness. Fear. As Rachel listened, she realized something. She wasn't crying. For the first time since this began, she didn't feel like a victim recounting her trauma. She felt like a woman standing in truth. And not just hers. Judge Foster listened without expression. She reviewed the affidavits, occasionally asking for clarification. After nearly an hour, she paused, set her pen down, and looked up. "I've reviewed the material submitted and find that the evidence presented is sufficient to warrant a formal trial," she said, her voice cutting clean through the silence. "We will set a date for the first court session within the next 2 weeks." Rachel felt Daniel squeeze her hand. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them, James was staring directly at her. But for the first time, he didn't look invincible. Outside the courthouse, the women gathered in the sunlight, faces flushed with a strange mixture of nerves and hope. "We did it," Caroline whispered. "It's actually going to trial." Jill placed a hand on her shoulder. "That was a brave thing you all just did. I hope you know that." Kayla nodded slowly. "I still feel like I'm going to throw up. But, yeah, it was brave." Rachel looked at the others. "He thought we'd never speak." "Well," said Teresa, "he was wrong." The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Nora and Jill coordinated interviews, scheduled pretrial meetings, and helped each woman prepare her testimony. They rehearsed questions and practiced staying calm under pressure. Ben Reed was contacted as well. He agreed to testify. His name would be made public. His role in the department would be questioned. But he never once hesitated. He showed up to every meeting, notebook in hand, eyes steady. When the trial date arrived, Rachel stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing the front of her dress. It wasn't fancy, just a soft navy fabric that fell to her knees. But it made her feel grounded. Daniel came to the doorway and smiled. "You look like yourself," he said. She turned. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." They drove to the courthouse in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was so much, and none of it needed words. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier than before. A few reporters sat in the back. The local news station had requested permission to cover the trial, and Judge Foster had allowed it, with limits. When James entered, he no longer looked so sure of himself. His eyes darted quickly to the media in the back, then to the front row where the victims sat. He was sweating. The trial began. Nora delivered the opening statement, clear, firm, unflinching. She spoke of power, how easily it can be misused, how quietly it can erode someone's dignity, and how dangerous silence can become when left unchecked. Vernon Blake responded with calm dismissal. "These are emotional recollections," he said. "And while we empathize with the discomfort these women describe, discomfort does not equal illegality." Then the witnesses were called. Rachel went first. She walked to the stand, her legs shaking slightly, but her back straight. She took the oath and sat down. "Tell us what happened," Nora asked. Rachel began slowly. She described the bakery, the sidewalk, the crowd, the cinnamon rolls, James's hands on her bag. The moment he lifted her coat and the world seemed to vanish. Her voice cracked once, but she didn't cry. She looked at the jury, at Judge Foster, and finally at James. "I was treated like I didn't matter," she said. "But I do. We all do. He made me feel like I was nothing, but I'm not. I'm someone. And I'm standing here now." Next came Kayla, then Caroline. Teresa followed, her hands trembling as she described how her daughter had come home crying, terrified and confused. Finally, Ben took the stand. The courtroom held its breath as the officer in uniform, now sitting opposite his former partner, opened his notebook and began to speak. "I saw things I should have stopped," Ben said. "I didn't. And that's on me. But I'm speaking now because people were hurt. Officer Whitaker used his badge to intimidate, to shame, to humiliate. That's not law enforcement. That's abuse." James stared daggers at him, but Ben didn't look away. "I became a cop to serve this community," he added. "This is part of that service, telling the truth, even when it costs you." When he stepped down, Rachel caught his eye. She gave him a small, grateful nod. He nodded back. The day ended with a recess. The courtroom slowly emptied, the reporters whispering, the public murmuring. But among the group that had once felt invisible, something else was rising, something like hope. Rachel stood with Daniel just outside the courthouse steps as the sun began to dip behind the trees. "You were incredible," Daniel said softly. "I didn't feel brave up there," she admitted. "You were," he said. "You are." And for the first time since the day it all began, Rachel believed him. The courtroom was quieter than usual when Judge Madeline Foster returned to the bench. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. The sun outside had slipped lower in the sky, and the tall windows glowed with late afternoon light. The buzz of reporters had softened, and even the rustle of papers had come to a halt. Rachel sat with Daniel in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Caroline, Kayla, Teresa, and little Jane were seated behind her, each holding their breath in silence. On the opposite side of the room, James Whitaker leaned back stiffly in his chair, jaw clenched, eyes unblinking. Judge Foster took her time settling in. She flipped through the files before her, adjusted her glasses, and finally looked out across the courtroom. The court has now reviewed the complete set of testimonies, statements, supporting documents, and cross-examinations provided over the course of this trial, she began, her voice calm and measured. It is not the role of this court at this stage to determine guilt or innocence. That decision belongs to the trial jury, should this case move forward. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. However, the judge continued, this hearing's purpose is to determine whether there are sufficient grounds to formally prosecute Officer James Whitaker on charges of abuse of authority, unlawful search, public indecency, and harassment. Rachel gripped Daniel's hand. The other women leaned forward ever so slightly, eyes fixed on the judge. I have listened closely to each witness, Judge Foster said. And while every citizen deserves the presumption of innocence, the pattern of behavior described in this courtroom cannot be ignored. The consistency among multiple, unrelated individuals paints a deeply troubling picture. James shifted in his seat. Furthermore, the testimony of Officer Benjamin Reed, supported by detailed written records spanning over a year, provides internal corroboration that these alleged actions were not isolated incidents, nor misunderstandings. They reveal a pattern of conduct that suggests a deliberate abuse of power aimed specifically at vulnerable individuals, and most often women. The room was so still, even the hum of the air vents felt loud. This court finds there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal prosecution against Officer James Whitaker. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The judge looked toward the defense table. Mr. Whitaker, you will be scheduled for a criminal trial, during which the prosecution will present its full case before a jury of your peers. Until that time, you are ordered to surrender your badge and service weapon and are placed on unpaid administrative leave effective immediately. James's face drained of color. For a moment, he didn't move. Bailiff, the judge said. The bailiff stepped forward and approached the defense table. Rachel didn't look away. She watched as James slowly removed his badge and slid it across the table, his hand lingering on it for a moment longer than necessary. His eyes were wide with disbelief, like the fall he never believed would come was now crashing down around him. He opened his mouth, as if to protest, but no words came out. The bailiff collected the badge and firearm, then led James out through the side door. Not in handcuffs, but without honor. As the door closed behind him, the silence in the room lifted. A hush of emotion swept through the gallery, not noise, exactly, but the exhale of people who had held their breath too long. Rachel sat still for several moments, not moving, not speaking. She felt lightheaded, like she had just stepped out of a storm she'd lived in for months. Daniel leaned in, voice quiet. He's going to trial. You did it. Rachel turned to look at him, eyes glossy with tears. We did it. From the back of the courtroom, Jill and Nora exchanged a look, a mix of relief and solemn pride. It wasn't over. But the first wall had come down. Outside, the sun was almost gone. The streetlights had flickered on, casting long, golden paths down the sidewalk. A small group of local residents had gathered near the steps, unsure what to expect. When Rachel walked out of the courthouse, flanked by Daniel and the other women, someone began to clap. It started with just one person, an older woman in a long coat, clutching a newspaper to her chest. Then another joined in. And another. The sound grew, not loud or rowdy, but warm. Respectful. A standing kind of gratitude. Rachel didn't wave. She didn't bow her head. She just stood still, feeling it wash over her, not praise, but acknowledgement. After everything, she was finally seen. Caroline moved closer and whispered, "It's real, isn't it? He's really going to face it." Rachel nodded. "Yes. And we're not invisible anymore." Ben emerged from a different door at the side of the building. He spotted the women, then slowly walked toward them. He looked different than he had in court, less like a uniform, more like a person carrying the weight of his own silence. When he reached Rachel, he stopped. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing up. You gave me the courage to speak." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "You did the right thing. And you still are." He nodded. "I'll be there at the trial. Every day." As the group dispersed, Rachel and Daniel walked down the sidewalk toward their car. The air was crisp, the first hint of winter clinging to the evening wind. Rachel looked up at the courthouse one last time. Its pillars didn't look quite so tall anymore. The final day of the trial arrived with a sky the color of slate and air that hung thick with anticipation. It was a Wednesday, ordinary to anyone not walking into that courtroom, but to Rachel, it felt like a chapter about to close. One she hadn't asked for, but one she had endured with everything she had. She stood in front of the mirror, buttoning her coat slowly, her hand steady. Daniel waited by the door, holding her scarf. "You okay?" he asked. Rachel turned to him. "No. But I'm ready." They arrived at the courthouse early. The courtroom was already beginning to fill, reporters in the back, legal aides taking their seats, members of the public quietly filing in, most of them curious, a few of them supportive. Caroline, Kayla, and Teresa sat together near the front, arms linked or hands clasped. Jane, Teresa's daughter, wasn't there, too young to bear the weight of a final verdict. But she had asked her mom to tell her everything when it was over. Ben arrived alone. He walked past James Whitaker without looking at him and took his seat beside the women whose stories had shaken him awake. He gave Rachel a quiet nod. She returned it with a soft, grateful smile. James sat with his attorney, his once proud shoulders slightly slumped. The confident look he had worn on the first day was gone now, replaced by a stony expression, equal parts frustration and disbelief. His suit jacket was rumpled at the collar. When Judge Madeline Foster entered the courtroom, the room rose. She carried the same calm authority she had throughout the trial. But there was something different in the air today. Finality. Everyone sat. Judge Foster wasted no time. This court has spent the last several weeks examining the testimony of witnesses, reviewing corroborating evidence, and hearing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, she began. Rachel stared ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I want to acknowledge the extraordinary courage of those who stepped forward to share their stories, Ms. Whitmore, Ms. Jensen, Ms. Turner, Ms. Martinez, and others. Their willingness to speak has brought to light actions that might otherwise have remained buried." James's attorney shifted in his seat, arms crossed. Judge Foster continued, "This case, while painful and difficult, has made clear the devastating effects of power when misused, and the strength it takes to confront that power with truth." There was a long pause before she looked directly at James. "Officer James Whitaker," she said, "based on the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds you guilty of multiple counts, including unlawful search, public harassment, and abuse of authority under the color of law." The words fell heavy, and for a moment, no one breathed. Rachel stared at the judge, then slowly turned toward James. His eyes were wide now, blinking, stunned. He opened his mouth slightly, but no words came. "The sentence," Judge Foster said firmly, "is 5 years in state prison. You are hereby barred from ever serving in law enforcement again." A soft murmur moved through the room, but no one spoke aloud. It was a sacred moment, something more than justice. A correction. A turning of the tide. James slumped back in his seat, his face pale. The bailiff stepped forward and asked him to stand. Slowly, James rose. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and for the first time, he looked less like a threat and more like a man forced to see himself clearly. Rachel didn't look away. She didn't need to. James was let out through the same side door he had once walked through freely. This time, the sound of the door closing behind him felt like a curtain falling on something dark. Judge Foster offered a final nod and rose from the bench. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and the room stirred to life. Rachel stood slowly. Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "You did it," he whispered. "It's over." But Rachel shook her head gently. "It's just beginning. For all of us." Caroline, Kayla, and Teresa came forward, their eyes misted with tears, their hands reaching out. The women embraced, no words needed. They had faced something terrifying and walked through it together. And now they stood taller for it. Ben joined them, his hands in his pockets, his expression quiet but resolute. "I wish I had spoken sooner," he said softly. "You spoke when it mattered," Rachel replied. "You helped make this happen." Outside, the sky had cleared. The sun had broken through, casting soft light over the courthouse steps. A few townspeople stood across the street, watching as the group emerged. Some nodded. Some clapped. Others simply stood in silence. Jill and Nora were waiting at the bottom of the steps, their eyes shining with pride. "You changed something today," Jill said to Rachel. "We all did," Rachel replied. A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, clutching a small notebook. She looked barely 20, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Ms. Whitmore? I just wanted to say thank you. I saw what happened to you months ago. I didn't know how to help. But you helped all of us." Rachel smiled, blinking back tears. "You're welcome," she said. "And you're not alone." That night, Rachel sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window at the evening sky. A breeze rustled the trees, and the wind chimes on the porch rang softly. Daniel walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and set one beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Rachel took a sip and set the cup down. "The beginning," she said. "That day outside the bakery. How lost I felt. How alone." Daniel sat beside her. "You're not that person anymore." Rachel nodded. "No, I'm not. But I still remember her. And I want to make sure no one else ever has to feel that way." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's the start of something bigger." Rachel smiled, softly, thoughtfully. "Maybe it is." In the following weeks, Rachel was asked to speak at community meetings. Her story inspired others to come forward, some from their own pasts, some to support those just beginning their healing. The women she stood beside in court remained in touch. They called themselves the Five, not out of pride, but out of purpose. Ben helped implement new training at the department, working with outside advisors to change the culture from within. It was hard. But change never came easy. As winter approached, Rachel walked through town with Daniel one Saturday morning, snow flurries dancing in the air. People greeted her by name now, not as the woman who had been humiliated, but as the woman who had stood up, spoken out, and never backed down. And as they walked past the little bakery where it all began, Rachel paused. She looked through the glass at the rows of fresh cinnamon rolls, the soft lights, the familiar faces. Then she walked inside. The same clerk from that day was behind the counter. She looked up, smiled, and said, "It's good to see you again, Ms. Whitmore." Rachel smiled back. "It's good to be seen." She picked out 2 cinnamon rolls and paid in cash. And when she stepped back outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, gentle, quiet, beautiful. Rachel looked up at the sky, then down at the warm paper bag in her hands. She turned to Daniel, who was watching her with quiet admiration. "I think," she said softly, "this is what peace feels like." He nodded. "And you earned every bit of it." Rachel looked out across the street, where the courthouse stood tall and steady. It would never be just a building to her again. It would always be a place where the truth was spoken, where courage stood up, and where justice, at long last, was served. And she had been part of it. In life, there are moments when silence feels safer than speaking out, especially when facing someone in power. But as Rachel's story reminds us, courage often begins in quiet places, in our living rooms, around kitchen tables, or in the soft decision to say, enough. The greatest change doesn't always come from loud voices. Sometimes it comes from steady hearts willing to stand for what's right. For seniors especially, who have seen decades of change, it's a reminder that your voice still matters, perhaps more than ever. Whether it's supporting a neighbor, reporting wrongdoing, or encouraging someone to seek justice, every act of integrity helps shape a more decent world. Rachel didn't just reclaim her dignity, she helped others find theirs. That's the power of truth and community. In your daily life, let this be a call to stay watchful, to extend kindness, and to speak when it's needed most. No matter your age, standing up for what's right has no expiration date. It's never too late to make a difference.